Hello, Dr. Dan Guerra here again from VerEvMed. Today I'd like to spend some time talking to you about an entire area of research, which we're going to start inspecting in a series of these YouTube lectures, these mini lectures. The overall topic is going to be aging, human aging, or as we shall see, the more correct term, senescence. What I want to do before we start the actual in-depth discovery by analyzing specific research papers, particularly about molecular, cellular, biochemical pathways and how they are the basis of the senescent process in human aging, I'd like to spend some time talking to you about how science is put together. That is, we know that empiricism plays a large role in how research is conducted. By empiricism, I mean gathering evidence after having an hypothesis generated via some kind of aspect of deductive reasoning. The hypothesis-driven research is the paradigm in science, and it's been that way for several hundred years. What I want to do is analyze how that aspect of research needs to be carefully scrutinized, so that when we go and look at, when we investigate, when we uncover those publications that we want to look at, we can discover at the same time whether or not appropriate skills of reasoning, that is, those aspects of and faculties of human reasoning, have been applied appropriately, so that the questions that are being asked not only are supported by good experimentation, that is, by methods that will give you results which are relatively unambiguous, but also that the reasoning behind the research and the reasoning used to evaluate the research is indeed beneficial to an understanding of the discipline. That is, that we are using the appropriate faculties of reason to discover what the science is about before it's set up and after it's been published. So again, we are VerEvMed. We are scientists who help discover by client question and interaction questions that we can then look at in the literature for you to be able to help determine aspects of science and or specific problems in your research agenda and evaluate what is published and carry out a verification of that evidence, again, in biomedicine, biopharmacy, nutrition, exercise, science, exercise physiology, microbiology, and most of the elements of what are called natural sciences. So we look at published literature in VerEvMed. So let's get started with this lecture today. Okay. So we're going to ask a question today, and then we're going to take a look at what's behind that question. The question is aging inevitable? And this is going to be a mini lecture examining that process. Okay. We're going to use as one of the documents to investigate from the published literature this paper is published in Science about 14, 15 months ago. It's a special issue on aging. That entire issue was a special issue on aging. And there you see the link at the bottom there. So that paper is actually open access right now. So you can read the paper at your leisure. So what is the basic understanding here about aging? First of all, let's go back and think about what we're doing now as compared to what we used to do. Major focus of biomedical research has traditionally been looking at pathogenesis and treatment of individual diseases: cancer, cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, to name three major ones. Now, there is in the National Institutes of Health a National Institute on Aging, the NIA. Okay, so of course we have National Institutes on Cancer, Diabetes, etc. But this one's on aging, so let's examine this. About 1/3 of the 2014 research budget was allocated to just one disease, that was Alzheimer's. And that percentage was asked to be increased by 50% in 2015, and then in 2016, and now in 2017. So the amount of money that was spent in 2016 was allocated at 638 millions. The new budget for 2017 is asking for an additional 323 million, which again is about a 50% uptick. That'll mean that we'll be spending about $1 billion on research in Alzheimer's disease. Now, except for accidents and deadly crime, which of course is another parameter of study, humans are living longer today than ever before. But living longer also means that we're suffering from more pathologies and morbidities. And these pathologies and morbidities end up decreasing the quality of life and essentially are associated with the aging process. So the question is, can we tear these two things apart? Does aging necessarily involve these pathologies and these diseases? And maybe rather than study the diseases, maybe we should be studying the aging process itself, right? So that's the ongoing assumption here. So this just breaks down for fiscal year 2017, that extra amount of money that's allocated for Alzheimer's disease. You can see the category A is the one that's going to give us the most amount of input. That would be $68 million because this is in thousands. Next to that would be diagnosis, assessment, and monitoring. And then third will be translational research such as drug discovery and epidemiology, category 4. So you can see that we're going to be spending a lot of time on basic research. Now, basic research in neuroscience, particularly in aging, has almost always been involving animal models, mice, rats, other mammals, as well, of course, C. elegans, the worm, the nematode, and Drosophila. Likewise, cell culture has been used to study aging. Human cells and animal cells, and even bacterial cells for that matter. So we have to ask the question, the fundamental question, is it a good assumption to make that studying these model organisms and not studying aging in humans, exactly in humans per se, is that really the best use of this funding? And will that extrapolate, will that bootstrap onto what we believe is the aging process at the molecular, cellular, physiological level, and indeed at the pathophysiological level? So that's, again, a corollary to the assumption that we're trying to set up here as to what kind of research we should be doing and what we should be funding. So let's talk a little bit about biological aging. Again, that's not the purpose of this lecture, but let's just set the stage. Biological aging is plastic, and it has provided tangible approaches to enhance healthy longevity. By plastic, what do we mean? That an effect is presented to a system, and that effect leaves long-lasting phenomena. So that means aging, of course, is chronological years where the vagaries of living itself will cause tissue decay, cause tissue senescence. And in that process itself, while it's plastic, meaning that it's learning by living, we can also consider that plasticity would allow us to intervene, maybe at the dietary level, maybe at exercise and diet, maybe at just overall lifestyle changes, so that we can affect a positive trajectory for that plasticity, maintaining good neural health as well as good muscular health, and therefore live a longer life that is also a healthier life. So that plasticity is something we can maybe take to our advantage. Now, there is an NIH Gerosciences interest group, and it was created to expedite a collaborative set of efforts to discover mechanisms of aging. And this, again, is going to involve animal models, tissue, as well as human cohort studies. The underlying hypothesis for this NIA interest group is that delaying the rate of biological aging, which we'll find in subsequent talks, basically is senescence and doesn't necessarily correlate to chronology, that delaying that rate of biological aging may simultaneously delay the onset and progression of some of these diseases, which eventually kill us. Cardiovascular disease, cancer, and metabolic disease, to name three big ones. Now, if that's the assumption, what else do we want to say about it? Perhaps it's critical to account for the biological effects of aging when developing theories for chronic disease and not appropriately managed in preclinical studies that use young animal models. So again, if we want to study aging, we don't want to study aging in young animals, we want to study it in old animals. And in fact, an aging mouse or an aging rat is not the same thing as an aging human. So again, are we going to get the kind of data that is really going to be useful for us to understand human aging by carrying out this sort of research? Maybe we better make sure when we're looking at the funding and when we're looking at what is published and then what is important for us when we ask questions about the aging process, what is relevant to the human studies, right? What is relevant to human aging? So successful modifications of intrinsic rates of aging will provide a much more effective approach. This is again an assumption for improving healthy longevity relative to strategies aimed at treating or curing an individual disease. So we want to look at human aging, and maybe we want to look at the aging mechanisms themselves. Okay, these are all the assumptions that we want to look at. We could say that the added value from targeting the underlying process of aging, senescence, and thereby delaying multiple age-related declines in function is the way to go. And we have a term for that. So we're going to assume that's correct, and that term is called longevity dividend. That is what we gain from studying the aging process and vis-a-vis those diseases associated with it by studying aging itself, right? Getting down to the fundamental ontology, that foundational ontology that is, some would argue, the basis for these diseases, these late in life diseases which eventually take the life. Now, given all these assumptions, we could then formulate a question using our faculties of reason. Where are the potential logical flaws in that entire concept trajectory? Are there flaws, and how might we pull them apart by using reasoning? Now, by reasoning, I want you to evaluate what I'm trying to get at. Science is an empirical endeavor. That is, we go in, we observe, we carry out controlled experiments, we have negative controls and positive controls, we vary given environmental conditions or different drug concentrations. We look at men versus women, we look at different races, and we look at different diets and different lifestyles, and we compare all of that to like-minded situations so that we develop an axis of understanding with our empirical observations. That's how research is normally considered being conducted. But just as important in those empirical observations and how empirical science works is our faculty of reason. So we need both good reasoning skills and good empirical skills to be able to come up with a clear understanding of what it is we are examining. Rational thought is necessary for all aspects of science: how research is developed, how the hypothesis is generated, the experiments designed, the results taken, the results then discussed, and finally what conclusions we can draw from it. All of that involves hardcore reasoning. So let's go back and think about how reasoning is done in humans. One way of going about it is to look at what's already known about reasoning. And in fact, there has been a great deal of work done on this in philosophy, particularly in categorical logic. We're just going to look at one element of this. There are others that we could examine, but this is a core one that I think most of us may have not thought about for a long time, and maybe a lot of younger people in the audience are not even aware of the square of opposition, which is a logical evaluation that involves categorical understanding of the way the mind goes about examining the world around it. Okay? So how does the square of opposition work? The traditional square of opposition involves two general aspects. One is that the logical opposition occurs among standard form categorical propositions. If one, they have the same subject and predicate terms, so they must have that, and two, they differ in quality or quantity or both. Okay, so those are categories of either existence or of thinking, whether or not you're an Aristotelian or a Kantian. Okay, but quality, quantity, relation, and modality are the four main categories that we ascribe to the world, the universe that we exist in. We're only going to compare quality and quantity here with the square of opposition, but this can, of course, be advanced to the other two categories. Second thing about the square of opposition is that consider the kinds of opposition that can be generated by these first two principles. Case one, you differ the quantity and quality. Two, differ the quality but not the quantity. Three, the quantity but not the quality. And four, you keep the same quantity and quality, but you still look at oppositional premises and propositions and try to draw conclusions from them. Okay, so those are four different potential cases. Here is a square. Let's take a look at the four corners. You've got A, okay? A propositions are universal affirmatives. They take the form of all S are P, okay? So we're breaking this down into logical terminology. We're abstracting. So a universal affirmative says all S are P. A universal negation is shown in E on the upper right part of the square. What does that say? It says no SRP. Okay? I propositions down there in the lower left are particular affirmatives. The first two are universal. Now we're talking about particulars. The I proposition is a particular affirmative which says some SRP. And the O proposition on the finishing out the square in the lower right here of this quadrant are, again, particular, but they are particular negations. And they take the form, some S are not P. Now, don't worry about feeling confused about this because we're going to go through this very systematically, very rationally. And I'm going to use an example. The example is going to be the topic that we're trying to essentially dissect here, starting with this initial preamble lecture. What is that? Aging. Okay, so again, there are the four corners of the chart. A propositions are universal affirmatives. E propositions are universal negations. I propositions are particular affirmatives, and O propositions are particular negations. Given the assumption made within classical categorical logic that every category contains at least one member, that's why you can do these comparisons, right? Because it has to contain the same terms, right? The following relationships depicted on the square will hold. Let's take a look at this now. Okay, there's a square up there, and let's take a look at what then we can determine using reason. Firstly, A and O propositions are contradictory, as are E and I propositions. Propositions are contradictory when the truth of one implies the falsity of the other, and conversely. Here we see that the truth of a proposition of the form all S are P implies the falsity of the corresponding proposition of the form some S are not P. Okay, so that contradiction goes from A, the upper left-hand quadrant, to O. That's a contradiction, you see. All right, for example, if the proposition is, now here I'm embedding a specific example. What is the example? Aging. For example, if the proposition is all aging is modifiable, okay, that's A. If that is true, then the proposition some aging is not modifiable, that's proposition O there, has to be false, right? If all aging is modifiable, then that can't hold, and some aging is not modifiable also hold. Okay, that's a contradiction. There's no middle term here, so that cannot hold, so those are contradictory. Similarly, if no aging is modifiable, okay, so now we're dealing with the universal negative, right? If that is false, then the proposition some aging is modifiable must be true. Okay? See how this works now. So we're going to go through all of these possible scenarios. So that's the first scenario. Second scenario. Again, as I go through these, look at the square. A and E propositions are contrary. Okay, so not contradictory, but contrary. So propositions are contrary when they cannot both be true. For example, an A proposition, all aging involves morbidity, cannot be true at the same time as the corresponding E proposition, no aging involves morbidity. Obviously, an absurd statement. Note, however, that the corresponding A and E propositions, while contrary, are not contradictory. While they cannot both be true, they can both be false. As with the examples of all aging causes Alzheimer's disease and no aging causes Alzheimer's disease. Both of those, you see, both of those, right? They can't both be true, but they can both be false. So that's the difference between contradictory and contrary. You see how much you get out of taking this rational aspect of reasoning and subjecting it to this square of opposition. Next, I and O propositions are subcontrary. What do we mean by that? Propositions are subcontrary when it is impossible for both to be false. Okay, false, not the universal truth, but false. So, here's my example. Delaying the rate of biological aging would simultaneously delay the onset and progression of diseases. Okay, that's the assumption, remember, from the National Institutes of Aging, right? Now, if that's false, then delaying the rate of biological aging would not simultaneously delay the onset and progression of diseases must be true. Okay. Note, however, that it is possible for the corresponding I and O propositions, the ones we just went through there, both to be true, as with some aging promotes disease and some aging does not promote disease. Again, I and O propositions are subcontrary, but not contrary and certainly not contradictory. Finally, again, examine the square. Two propositions are said to stand in relation of subalternation when the truth of the first, which is the superaltern, implies the truth of the second, the subaltern, but not conversely. So, A propositions stand in the subalternation relation with the corresponding I proposition. You see there, A going to I is a subalternation. Okay? The truth of the proposition A, this is again a universal, a positive universal, all longevity dividends are ethical. Again, what does that mean? Well, a longevity dividend that would involve, let's say, corrective surgery. Certainly that seems ethical, such as heart surgery, heart transplant for that matter. But let's think about this. Are all longevity dividends ethical? What do we think about gene targeting technology, such as the CRISPR-Cas system? Are we okay with changing gene expression at the embryonic stage and letting that then turn into a fetus and letting that fetus become a child? Are we okay with genetically modifying, right? Making superhuman beings? Right now, society has a ban against this, right? So certainly not all longevity dividends at this point in time in human understanding are ethical. Okay? So this is a valid question. So That implies the truth of the proposition, some longevity dividends are ethical. You see? So that's the subaltern. However, the truth of the O proposition, right, some longevity dividends are not ethical, does not imply the truth of the E proposition, which is, in this example, no, this is the universal negative, no longevity dividends are ethical. Okay? So in traditional logic, the truth of an A or E proposition implies the truth of the corresponding I or O proposition, respectively. That's the subaltern movement, you see? Consequently, the falsity of an I or an O proposition implies the falsity of the corresponding A or E proposition, respectively. Yeah. See how much information you gain before you ever set up an experiment, before you even generate the hypothetical deduction. So how does this come together? Well, I will suggest there is a resonating feature, and there's an existential aspect to it. What's the resonating feature I would like to suggest? The truth of a particular proposition does not imply the truth of the corresponding universal proposition, nor does the falsity of the universal proposition carry downwards to the respective particular proposition. Okay. I think we could see that from the example I just used. So here's the existential import of that suggestion. Without the traditional presuppositions of existential import, that is, the supposition that all categories have at least one member, right? That was how we put together the square. Then only the contradictory relationships will hold. And if we do that, if we get rid of all the contraries, what happens? Well, that's sometimes called the modern square of opposition. And all the lines for contraries and subcontraries and subalterns, we could erase all of those, really simplify. Unfortunately, that looks like what we do in science these days, if we even get to that. All we look for is contradictions, not contrariness, not subalterns. Shouldn't we be looking at all aspects of that square of opposition? After all, don't those then encompass at least some full aspect of one of the faculties of reasoning, that is, the understanding, and maybe implicate the other major faculty of reasoning, which is the imagination? The faculty of the understanding is populated by concepts, while the faculty of the imagination is populated by ideas. So both are really at play here, specifically science, but really all judgments that we make as human beings. So let's get down to what this might suggest. If we cannot presuppose and therefore assert as a first premise, because it's not demonstrated, so if you can't assert a first premise because you can't demonstrate it, what you end up with? The concept that aging can be extended indefinitely, which is an argument out there in biomedicine, I must say. Then we cannot assert that some aging can be extended indefinitely just by applying the rules of categorical logic as per using the square of opposition. Therefore, this is the concluding suggestion here, we can only say after this exercise that aging may or may not be extended indefinitely. And by indefinitely, I do not mean eternally. I do not mean infinitely. So neither in time or space, okay? Indefinite just means until some other time, right? Indefinite just means not an exact time, but some time not defined. Doesn't mean eternal. It doesn't mean ongoing, right? Right. So that's the best we can do, right? So again, let's think back about aging. And let's think about the money that's spent on aging. There'll be some $1 billion spent just on Alzheimer's research. Obviously, a very important aspect of science, something that a lot of people are very concerned about. We don't know still very much about why only about 50% of people over 65 get Alzheimer's. We don't know why some people that are 65 to 70 get it, and yet many other people don't get it until they're 70 or 75 or 80 or 85. But we know that each 5-year increment after 65, your chances of getting Alzheimer's disease increases somewhat linearly. Okay? Yet, in the end, even when people live to be 90, 95 and die from other natural causes, such as cancer, like a tumor, for example, or heart disease, another major killer, right? Or metabolic disease, 50% of those people, even after autopsy of their brains, don't appear to have the etiology of Alzheimer's disease. And if they had no behavioral responses while they were aging, then it's pretty likely they didn't have the disease. So that means we need to reevaluate as we generate our deductions and our hypotheses, how we're going to go about studying this. And an argument can be made that we need to analyze that using the full approach of our reasoning. So that's the reason I wanted to talk to you about this. At VerEvMed, we bring full to bear to the table that strong faculty of understanding and equally potent faculty of the imagination. We use those to dig into the scientific literature, the published literature, and answer your questions, be it aging, cancer, drug interactions, diets, exercise programs, microbiome, genome, proteome, lipidome, whatever happens to be something that you're interested in. We're going to go into that literature using those high-level skills of reasoning. And when we do that, and we present it to you, and we have an interaction with you, we communicate with you one-on-one, then you will then be able to evaluate that scientific literature, first of all, at the empirical level. What is it saying? What does the evidence tell us? But also that very, very important realm of verification. And that verification involves, again, the hardcore faculties of reason, of which I just gave you a very brief introduction of, but which one can bring to bear and command when studying the scientific literature. I really thank you very much for taking your time to listen to my mini lecture. Again, our email address is info@verevmed.com, and our website is www.verevmed. If you come to our website, you'll see the kinds of things we offer. If you contact us with our email address, we can get right to discussing specific questions you may have. Again, what we do, we are scientists, and we verify published evidence in medical biosciences, and we do so by using the faculties of reason. Thank you very much again for your attention, and I hope you have a pleasant day ahead of you. Bye.